The heavy scent of lilies filled the air, an almost oppressive fragrance that seemed to cling to every surface as mourners shuffled into the cold, dimly lit room. The funeral home had a stark, clinical feel, its sterile white walls casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. It was as if the very space itself was steeped in a sense of finality, a place where time itself had decided to pause. Relatives and friends gathered in hushed clumps, exchanging quiet words, but their voices were muffled, as though the very act of mourning had been hushed by the heavy silence. There was no crying, just the low murmur of a collective discomfort, the realization that a significant chapter in many lives had just come to an end. And yet, in the air, there was an unnerving sense that something wasn't right, something far more ominous than grief. At the front of the room, the mourners sat stiffly on uncomfortable chairs, their bodies rigid as if the weight of their own expectations was unbearable. Their faces were a mixture of sadness and confusion, with some looking straight ahead at the closed casket, others nervously avoiding eye contact, all of them trying to process the emotions flooding their hearts. My Uncle Lawrence, a man who had always been larger than life, lay in the casket before them, his face unnervingly calm, as though he were just sleeping, not a man who had spent his final days locked away in solitude, away from the people who might have truly cared for him. But that was my uncle for you, distant, aloof, always keeping his secrets close. Still, there was no denying the fact that in his final moments, his wealth, the empire he had spent his life building, was the one thing that remained his most faithful companion. I could barely bring myself to look at him. The memories of childhood, of spending summers at his lavish estate, felt distant now. Uncle Lawrence had been a monumental figure in my life. He was successful, sharp-tongued, always the one who had the answer to every problem, yet he never seemed to care about any of us. He had no children of his own, and his brother, my father, had passed away years ago. In a twisted way, I had always believed, even during the darkest years of our estrangement, that I would inherit everything. After all, who else could it be? His distant relatives, his business partners. Surely his legacy would be passed to someone who had known him, who had at least been in his presence long enough to deserve a portion of his wealth. But here, at this moment, surrounded by the sea of unfamiliar faces, I began to question my assumptions. Had I been blind all these years, thinking I was his rightful heir? Was there more to this story than I was willing to acknowledge? The lawyer, a man who looked as if he had just stepped out of an old courtroom drama, stood by the podium at the front. His name was Mr. Fenwick, and I had known him my whole life. His pale, almost sickly complexion stood in stark contrast to the dark, well-tailored suit he wore. His thin lips, always tight and controlled, rarely gave away a hint of emotion, but today they were more pressed than usual. His sharp, polished spectacles caught the light in a way that made him seem even colder, as if he could see through the very souls of the people gathered here. But even more chilling was the way he seemed to move, as though his very existence was tied to the will of Uncle Lawrence, as though he were the puppet master in this twisted little drama. He had been Uncle Lawrence's confidant for decades, and though I had always trusted him as a necessary evil, today I felt an unsettling sense of dread whenever his eyes met mine. It wasn't just the atmosphere that weighed on my mind, it was the bitter words my uncle had spoken repeatedly during his final years. "I have no intention of handing my fortune to anyone who doesn't deserve it," he had once told me, his tone hard and unforgiving, as if that declaration was some sort of proof of his disdain for everyone who had ever been close to him. I had heard these words so often, and yet they had always felt like idle threats, as if he were just trying to push me away, to make me prove myself worthy of the inheritance he was always going to give me. But now, as I stood there, surrounded by strangers, I realized that these words might not have been threats at all. They might have been the bitter truth. The thought gnawed at me, pulling at my gut like a bad omen. Finally, as the murmuring among the crowd died down, the lawyer cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the room with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "If I may," he said, his tone unexpectedly calm for the tension that hung thick in the air, "please gather around." The crowd shifted uneasily, and my heart began to race in anticipation. But there was something in the way Mr. Fenwick spoke, something that made me pause. His voice was too calm, too controlled. There was an unsettling certainty in his manner, as if he had already seen this scene unfold 1,000 times before, as if this moment wasn't a grand revelation, but just another ordinary day in the life of the executor of Uncle Lawrence's estate. This wasn't just a reading of a will, this was the moment that would change everything. As Mr. Fenwick unrolled the will, the room seemed to hold its breath. The silence was thick, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. My pulse raced in my ears, louder than the murmur of the others. There was an odd sense of inevitability that gripped me now, a certainty that something was about to happen that would break the calm facade of this entire gathering. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the distant relatives who had gathered, each one seemingly as clueless as I was. There were a few distant cousins and distant friends who had rarely rarely, if ever, spoken to my uncle, yet here they were, as if they were waiting for their share of something they had no claim to. How could they? What right did they have to this fortune? And then there was my uncle's brother, my estranged father's sibling. Uncle Lawrence had always viewed him with disdain. Two men who had never reconciled after their bitter fallouts years ago. Yet, my uncle's death had brought them back together in this twisted way, and I couldn't help but wonder if that hatred would make an appearance today. Would it reveal itself in the form of a dramatic outburst, an angry objection to what the lawyer was about to say? Or was it simply buried beneath the surface, buried in the past? The thought made my skin crawl, and I could feel a deep unease settling in my stomach. Mr. Fenwick's voice broke the tension, sharp and deliberate. "As per Mr. Lawrence's last wishes," he began, his gaze sweeping over the room with calculated precision, "the estate shall be divided among those whom he deemed worthy of inheriting his legacy." My heart skipped a beat. "However," he continued, "there is a condition." The word hung in the air like a dark cloud, and I could see the shift in the room. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the unease spreading like wildfire. I felt my throat go dry as the lawyer slowly adjusted his glasses and looked at each person present. He paused, letting the weight of the moment hang over us before he continued. I couldn't tear my gaze away from him. His calm demeanor was a contrast to the storm brewing inside me. He looked prepared, as if he knew exactly what was coming next. Was this all part of a larger plan? Had my uncle anticipated every reaction, every emotion we would experience in this room? My mind raced with possibilities, all of them dark. Had he planned this down to the very last detail, knowing how it would unfold? The idea that my uncle had orchestrated his own posthumous drama, one where we were all mere players, was a chilling thought. "You are not inheriting a dime," Mr. Fenwick finally declared, his voice ringing out in the quiet room. The words struck like a blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. I heard the collective gasps from the others, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock, but I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The lawyer didn't pause for any reaction, didn't wait for the shock to subside. Instead, he let out a soft chuckle, one that was entirely out of place in the somber atmosphere. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but a deep, knowing sound, as though something far more complex was unfolding right before our eyes. His laughter reverberated through the room, and for the first time, I felt a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The air in the room seemed to freeze after Mr. Fenwick's words. The words, "You are not inheriting a dime," echoed in my ears, reverberating like a distant bell tolling in a cavernous hall. It felt like the room itself had suddenly been compressed, as if the walls were closing in on me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I couldn't process what I had just heard. Was it a joke? A mistake? But the expression on the lawyer's face told me everything I needed to know. This was no error. It was deliberate. It was final. The inheritance that I had spent years imagining, planning for, was gone, just like that. The realization began to settle over me like a blanket of ice, cold and suffocating. My mind reeled, trying to catch up with the absurdity of the situation. How could this be? I had been Uncle Lawrence's closest living relative, the one who had been there through the years of estrangement, the one who had always believed, perhaps foolishly, that he would leave everything to me. We had been through so much, even though he never showed any real affection. I had, in my own way, been loyal to him, even during the times when he pushed me away. And yet here I was, in a room full of people who, to me, had no right to anything my uncle had worked so hard for, and suddenly they were being handed something I thought I was entitled to. How could he do this? Why? The questions spun in my head, desperate for answers, but there was none to be found. The lawyer, seeing our collective shock, seemed almost amused. His lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of kindness. No, it was something far colder, an almost sinister smile, the kind that someone gives when they know something you don't, when they hold the key to a door you can't open. "You see," Mr. Fenwick said, his voice now taking on an almost theatrical quality, "Mr. Lawrence had his reasons for these decisions." He paused, scanning the room with a gleam in his eye. Reasons that were carefully thought out. After all, not all legacies are meant to be passed on simply by blood. His words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. It was as if he knew exactly what was going through our minds and was savoring the moment. He knew we were all hungry for an explanation, desperate for answers, but he was determined to withhold them just a little longer. I could feel the blood rush to my face as anger slowly began to take root in my chest. The question why repeated over and over in my head, but I had no one to ask it to. No one except this cold, calculating lawyer who was enjoying every second of our discomfort. And then, as if on cue, Mr. Fenwick lifted a single piece of paper from the table in front of him and slowly, deliberately began to unfold it. "You were not meant to inherit, not because of any failing on your part, but because your uncle believed in a more unconventional way of securing his legacy," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "You see, the true heir to his estate was never meant to be a family member at all. It was someone far more fitting, someone who embodied the very values he held dear." The room fell into a stunned silence as his words hung in the air. Everyone in the room, including myself, was waiting for him to continue, desperate to know who this mysterious, true heir was. My heart was racing, the blood pounding in my ears. I could feel the weight of the room's collective gaze upon me, each person wondering if I had some clue, some piece of information that could shed light on the situation. I didn't. I had nothing. My hands trembled as I stood there, unable to form a coherent thought, let alone speak. The pieces of the puzzle that had once seemed so simple, the inheritance, my relationship with my uncle, the years of bitterness, were suddenly scattered before me like shards of glass, each one more painful to pick up than the last. And then, as if to heighten the drama even further, Mr. Fenwick finally revealed the truth, a truth that hit harder than any slap to the face could have. Your uncle's true heir, he said, his voice now carrying the weight of a bombshell, was the person who had been closest to him in his final years. It wasn't any of you. It was someone you'd never suspect. Someone who, in your eyes, was nothing more than a servant, a shadow in the background of your uncle's life, the one who kept him company when none of you bothered to visit. My heart skipped a beat as he spoke those words, and the blood drained from my face. It was impossible. There was no way. It couldn't be true. And yet, as Mr. Fenwick's eyes locked onto mine, I knew with a sinking certainty that the name he was about to reveal would shatter everything I had ever known. Mr. Fenwick's gaze lingered over the room, his eyes sharp and calculating, as if he were savoring the suspense he had so carefully built. His lips curled slightly, and for a brief moment I could have sworn I saw something almost predatory in his expression. He knew exactly the effect his words were having on us. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, each beat more erratic than the last. My mind scrambled, desperate to make sense of what he had just said. Someone who had been a servant to my uncle, but that made no sense. My uncle, for all his faults, had never trusted anyone so completely. He had pushed everyone away in his final years, and there was no one I knew who had been close to him. He had no friends left, only distant acquaintances who might have been able to fake intimacy for a share of his fortune. But Mr. Fenwick's smile remained unwavering, a subtle and cruel reminder that he was the one holding all the answers. He glanced down at the will in his hands, the paper rustling in the silence as if to amplify the growing tension. You may not know this person, he continued, his voice smooth like syrup, but you've all seen them before. My stomach turned. Who was this person? The name hovered on the edge of my consciousness, teasing me, but I couldn't quite grasp it. I looked around the room, trying to read the faces of those gathered. No one looked any less confused than I felt. I could sense a shift among the crowd, a growing realization that we were all missing something crucial, something right in front of us. And then, with the weight of the moment bearing down on all of us, Mr. Fenwick finally spoke the name that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The true heir to Mr. Lawrence's estate, he said, his voice now steady and unyielding, is Anna, the housekeeper. The words hit me like a physical blow, so strong that I almost staggered. Anna, the housekeeper? How was that possible? She had been nothing more than a quiet, unassuming woman who tended to my uncle's estate in the final years of his life. She was barely mentioned in conversation, always lurking in the background like a ghost, never once attracting attention. To everyone in this room, she had been nothing more than an employee, a nameless, faceless figure who had merely performed her duties. And yet here she was, his heir. The room was frozen in shock. I felt my hands begin to shake uncontrollably, my mind struggling to process the words that had just shattered everything I thought I knew about my uncle. Anna, the woman who had always been polite but distant, who had smiled when spoken to but never said much more than a few polite pleasantries. I had never thought much of her. None of us had. She was a fixture, nothing more, a servant. Yet, as the reality of her inheritance began to sink in, I realized just how wrong I had been. She had been the one my uncle trusted, the one who had cared for him in his final years, the one who had been with him when no one else had bothered to show up, and now she was walking away with everything. I turned to look at Anna, who was standing at the far side of the room, her face as impassive as ever. She had been quietly watching the proceedings, but now her eyes met mine. There was no triumph, no smugness in her gaze, just calm, as if this moment were nothing more than a formality for her. She seemed almost relieved, but not in the way I had expected. There was no joy in her expression, no sense of victory. Instead, there was something deeper, something almost sorrowful. It was as if she had known all along that this was her destiny, that she was the one meant to inherit. But what did that mean for me? For all of us? Had I really been so blind, so consumed by my own sense of entitlement, that I had missed the bond between her and my uncle? Had we all been so caught up in our own bitterness that we failed to see the quiet loyalty she had shown him? As the room began to stir, murmurs of disbelief spreading like wildfire, I realized something else. Anna wasn't just inheriting money or property. She was inheriting the life that I had once imagined for myself. myself, the power, the legacy, the history of my uncle's name. And with that realization came a sense of finality. There would be no changing the outcome, no fighting it. The will was clear. Mr. Fenwick's words were final. I could feel the weight of that finality pressing down on me like a suffocating force. I wanted to scream, to shout at him, to demand that something be done, but I couldn't. The truth was too painful. Anna had won, not through scheming or manipulation, but through quiet dedication and care. In the end, it wasn't the loudest voice that mattered. It was the one that had been the most present. The silence in the room was suffocating, pressing in on me from every direction. The revelation that Anna, the housekeeper, was my uncle's true heir sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. Everyone was talking, whispering, their voices bouncing off the cold walls, but I barely heard them. The weight of it all was too much to bear. My legs felt weak, and for a moment I feared I might collapse right there on the spot. Anna, quiet, humble, seemingly insignificant, was the one my uncle had trusted enough to pass on his entire estate. The empire he had built, the wealth, the power, the legacy, all of it was now in her hands. It was an unimaginable turn of events, and yet, as much as I wanted to deny it, I knew it was true. There was no way to fight it. The will had been read. The lawyer's words were clear, and Anna, the one person I had never once considered as a threat, was now the victor in this twisted game. I couldn't look at her. The anger, the humiliation, the sheer sense of betrayal clawed at my chest like a wild animal. I had spent my entire life imagining what it would be like to inherit my uncle's wealth, to take his place, to live a life of luxury and power. I had planned my future around the assumption that one day it would all be mine. But now, standing here in the wake of this revelation, I realized how foolish I had been. My uncle had always been a man of complexity, someone whose decisions were never easy to predict. I had thought I understood him, thought that his coldness was just a way to push people away, a facade hiding his affection for those closest to him. But in the end, I had been blind to the truth that had been in front of me all along. My uncle's loyalty had never been to me. It had been to Anna, the one person who had stood by him in his final years when none of us had bothered to care. As I stood there, trying to process everything that had just unfolded, I could feel my emotions begin to surge. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation from Anna, to confront Mr. Fenwick and question how this could have happened. But deep down, I knew that it was too late for that. The damage had been done. The will had been signed. The inheritance decided, and there was no way to undo what had been set in motion. What was left for me now? Where did I go from here? The weight of it all was suffocating, and for a moment I felt lost. But then, as I looked back at Anna, I realized something that made my stomach twist with a strange mixture of guilt and clarity. She wasn't the enemy. She wasn't the one who had wronged me. No, the blame lay elsewhere. The blame lay with my uncle. He had made his choice long before his death. Anna had simply been the person who had remained loyal, who had given him the care and attention none of us had. She had earned her place as his heir, and no amount of anger or resentment on my part could change that. I turned my gaze back to the lawyer, who stood silently by the podium, watching the scene unfold with a detached air. There was something about his calm demeanor that unsettled me. It was as if he had known all along that this was how things would play out. He had orchestrated it all, carefully guiding us through the process, knowing full well the shock and outrage we would feel. He had been Uncle Lawrence's confidant, his executor, the one person who had been trusted with all of his final wishes. And now, as the last of the mourning relatives began to leave the room, their faces filled with confusion and disbelief, I couldn't help but wonder how much more Mr. Fenwick knew. Had he been part of this plan all along, or had he simply been carrying out his duties as instructed? Whatever the case, there was no denying that he had played a pivotal role in this saga, one that had torn apart the last vestiges of my relationship with my uncle, and perhaps even with my family. But amidst the confusion and the pain, there was one thing that became painfully clear to me. I had spent so much of my life chasing after something that I thought was mine by right, that I had forgotten what truly mattered. The inheritance, the wealth, the legacy. It had all seemed so important, so crucial to my sense of self-worth. But now, standing here in the wreckage of my own expectations, I realized that those things meant nothing. They were fleeting, empty things. What mattered was the bond between people, the loyalty and care that transcended money or status. Anna had been the one who had shown my uncle that, not me, and though it stung to admit it, I had to acknowledge that perhaps, in the end, I had been the one who had failed him. As I made my way toward the exit, my mind still racing, I caught a glimpse of Anna once more. She was standing by the door, her expression unreadable, as if she too was lost in her own thoughts. She had no reason to look back at me, no reason to care about the bitter emotions I was carrying with me. She had won, and perhaps that was the final lesson my uncle had meant to teach me, that the things I thought I wanted, the things I thought I deserved, were not the things that truly mattered. In the end, it was the quiet acts of kindness, the moments of loyalty that defined a person's worth. I had spent so long chasing after the wrong things, and now it was too late to change that. As the door closed behind me, I took a final look at the room where it had all ended. My uncle's estate, my lost inheritance, and the hollow feeling of regret that had settled in my chest. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss anything. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the story. We'd love to hear from you.